Hi, and welcome to today's episode of Leadership in Extraordinary Times. I'm Professor Andrew Stephen, the L'Oreal Professor of Marketing and Associate Dean of Research here at the Saïd Business School at University of Oxford. Today, we are talking about how businesses can use AI responsibly, which is obviously a really big topic, but we're going to try and unpack that and make it as practical as we possibly can throughout today's discussion. I want to welcome all of you, wherever you happen to be, watching us from today. Thank you for joining us. And I want to extend a special welcome, actually, to our Oxford Executive Diploma in AI for Business students, some of whom are here in the building here at the Saïd Business School, and others who are around the world joining us today. Because actually today is the first day of one of our modules of that Executive Diploma program. And what better topic to talk about for an AI program than responsible AI in business. So what we're going to do over the course of the next 45 minutes or so is break down this topic. And we're going to hear from Dr. Yasmeen Ahmad, who is the Vice President for Strategy at Teradata, as well as Dr. Natalia Efremova, who is the Teradata Research Fellow in AI and Marketing here at the Saïd Business School, working in the Oxford Future of Marketing Initiative. And so we'll hear from them in a little while to really talk about this from both a technical and a practical standpoint. But first, I want to bring in my colleague, Dr. Felipe Thomaz, who's an Associate Professor of Marketing here at the Saïd Business School. And Felipe's been heading up a project that a number of us have been working on over the last few months with the International Chamber of Commerce in drafting some guidance for the private sector around responsible AI. So I thought we'd kick things off by having a chat with Felipe about this project, which is about to be released next week. In fact, we'll be releasing the report to come out of this research project. So Felipe, welcome. Thank you for joining us. For those of you watching at home, Felipe is literally on the other side of the wall to me, but we're distancing ourselves. So Felipe, thanks. So why don't you start by telling us a little bit about this project that we've been working on over the last few months with the ICC.
Yeah, so thank you, Andrew. It's a very exciting project, right? As you've described, like there's a lot to talk about in responsible business, and responsible application of AI, and then the ethical application of AI as something particularly thorny in terms of being able to discuss. So we wanted to see how we could bring a lot of companies up to speed, and the world's a nice big place with a lot of variability in adoption of technology. So there's a lot of opportunity for people to just really get their businesses up and running to the next level of AI aptitude, but to do so well and to do so responsibly and ethically. So the challenge was, how do we synthesize what we know about responsible AI applications and ethical considerations and ethical risks in AI, and organize it in a way that is business sensible, and it is in a way organized to allow a manager to implement and actually put it to use, so that they can just go ahead and take those initial steps.
All right. So what are some of those steps that need to be taken? Because part of this is very much about coming up with things that businesses can do to try and ensure that the work that they're doing around AI and machine learning is responsible, is ethical, is appropriate. What are some of the elements in your framework?
Right. So to start out, one of the things that we had to do in order to force it towards a business-oriented and actually a managerially useful approach was actually to force a hierarchy onto some of complex ethical ideas. Basically, is organizing the questions around what is right, what is correct, and organizing the trade-offs that managers are going to face in a way that allows them to actually analyze their environment. So I know still very much into like ethereal land and discussion here, but just to say that to go to a framework, we are actually forcing a way for managers to make trade-offs in decisions and assist in decision making. So to do that is starting to go from the most complex ideas to the more simple ideas that make up those more esoteric concepts. So ethics is essentially a combination of responsibility and accountability. And then responsibility becomes human centricity, fairness, and the ability to be harmless in your execution. And the report is going to have the full kind of components available for people to dive in. But the idea is to say, how do the pieces fit together? How do we organize them in a way that I say what has priority, what is more important than another, to allow for these trade-offs. Now, when I take it to reality and I go, right, let's go, how do I do this as a manager? How do I organize my business to start leveraging these things? We start to get to those practical points. And what we're trying to do is say, okay, you're going to start from the technical aspect of the AI. You're going to go to your workflow. From that workflow, you're going to overlay an ethical design component onto it, which is essentially saying, here are the steps that I'm going to take. So very broadly, let's think of, here's my data concerns, here's my algorithmic choices, and here's my business case, business use, what I'm going to use my outputs for. And you just map all of that out, and that overlay of ethics comes in and starts asking questions of the manager, saying, do I have specific threats or risks or concerns arising from my data sourcing? Do I have ethics, concerns, risks associated with my data cleaning and processing, pre-processing, how I use it, how I absorb it into my company? All of those things start getting mapped so that you have a good understanding of these potential threats to your ethics stance, right? So you're saying, I want to do things well, then there are aspects within your design of your workflow for your AI application that can give rise to some complications. The first step then is to map those, identify what they are, and then we fall into some fairly robust managerial aspects where we say, okay, what are those mitigation strategies that I can bring to bear to account for this risk exposure that I have? How do I minimize my risk exposure? And these are ethical risks, breaches, potential breaches that you can have, and doing incorrect things, and then institutionalizing them via AI, or just like embedding them into code, as it were, and just perpetuating those errors. So this is an early mapping, understanding how it fits within what you're trying to apply, and then minimize and mitigate, and just live with that notion and that idea of saying that I'm going to revisit and keep coming back to this process to saying, do I have new threats? Do I recognize new things? Am I changing anything in my workflow? In able to actually start delivering against that goal, which is what is the most responsible, what is a properly ethical application of AI for my business?
So, okay, there's lots that I want to talk about there, but I do want to just remind everyone in the audience to please feel free to put some questions to us. We'll come back to your questions later. Keep them brief and to the point as much as you can, please. And so, Felipe, this research that we're talking about is going to be released next week. And if anyone is wanting to find out more, they can visit oxfordfutureofmarketing.com. So what I'm hearing from you is in some sense saying, look, it's not about changing the way that you do everything. It's about sort of bringing sort of responsible, ethical, accountable notions around AI and data and analytics usage into, I guess, existing workflows, which I think is quite appealing, right? It's not about overhauling everything we do for this new way of doing things, but rather finding, I guess, some kind of happy medium. Am I getting it right in that characterization, the way that you're thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important for managers everywhere, really, to have that sense of terra firma, essentially saying, like, this is familiar ground. This is something that we do in business day in, day out. Like, there's a lot of new news with AI. There's a lot of hype with AI. There's a lot of uncertainty around AI, even, to get into the whole definition and all the variations of it. But from the business sense and for the business case use of it, it's very useful to go back to some of those basic ideas and saying, like, actually, I might have a new business model, I might have new capabilities, but actually the art and science of management behind it, it's still relatively stable, that I can have appropriate controls over these different components. It's a new machine, but actually how I manage that machinery, doesn't have a whole lot of new moving parts to it. We have some concerns that are specific to AI and some uniqueness that we describe, and we were able to leverage a lot of pre-existing, like one of the most exciting parts for me for this project was the way that we arrived at these recommendations was by actually going to existing body of knowledge. Everything that companies have mentioned on their stances, their guidances, governments, NGOs, intergovernmental agencies, we took all of that body of knowledge as well as academic literature on responsibility and ethics and AI, put it all together and use our own AI machinery on it to organize it and give it the shape to put things in perspective.
So I think what you're talking about here is I think quite an appealing
against it.
Sorry, I think what you're talking about here is quite an appealing, I guess, process for businesses of all kinds of shapes and sizes to use. And I like that kind of, that statement you said that businesses need that terra firma, which is business, and they want to come back to that. But it's also suggesting that businesses themselves need to be taking responsibility for responsible AI. So I actually I want to hear what you all watching think about this. So we're going to do a poll, and I'm going to invite you to do an online poll, and we'll come back to the results a little bit later on in the program. But the question is, who should be most responsible for ensuring that applications of AI in the private and public sectors are appropriate, ethical, and responsible? So is it government, is it the tech companies, and so on and so on? Whether it's industry bodies or the businesses themselves, maybe intergovernmental organizations like the United Nations, or individuals. So tell us what you think by going to the link that's on the screen now, and we'll come back a little bit later to hear what you collectively think, and we'll discuss that with our panel. But Felipe, one other thing I wanted to talk about with you is you mentioned sort of, I guess, these principles or pillars of thinking about what I guess a set of guidelines or policies for responsible AI in the private sector would be. There's a term that you mentioned that I really want to hear a little bit more on, which is human-centricity. What do you mean by that?
So that one is kind of one of the most important layers of the ethics considerations, which probably shouldn't surprise anybody in the room, right? We're talking about ethics and human considerations, the consequences that impacts on individuals, human individuals here. So here what we're talking about is a combination of actually achievable means and goals within the AI to deliver on human benefits. So one core thing inside of that is this idea of beneficence, which is you're going to generate something good out of this process for people. It can be very broad, or it can be like a good business outcome that comes out of it. A transparency, which is often discussed in terms of like how deploying trustworthy AI, so on, the idea to have an intelligible, understandable system. All of these are components that make it centered around the human, essentially. It's almost like using the word to define itself. Is the more that a human can interact, and the more that the system then appreciates that there's a human that is going to bear a consequence of our automated decision-making, then the more stable you are into being a responsible business. And the more grounded you are in the fact that there's going to be a human cost associated with some of the decisions that we make inside of our businesses.
All right, thank you. So Felipe, sit tight because we'll come back to you in the Q&A a little bit later. So thanks, Dr. Felipe Thomaz, Associate Professor of Marketing. I want to now bring in our two panelists. As I introduced before, Dr. Yasmeen Ahmad, who is VP of Strategy at Teradata, which is an enterprise technology company, and Dr. Natalia Efremova, who is a computer scientist and is the Teradata Research Fellow in Marketing and AI here at the Saïd Business School. And Natalia was also heavily involved in the research work that Felipe was just telling us about. So welcome to both of you. What I want to do, and we'll come to the poll results a little bit later as well, but first I want to actually come to a question that actually has popped up from some of our AI diploma, executive AI diploma students, which is actually around sort of, how well a business is doing at the moment. So Andrew, Claire, and a few others have asked this question from that group. If we sort of think about responsible AI, where's kind of the starting point at the moment with businesses? Are businesses already pretty responsible with this, or is there room for improvement? Yasmeen, let me go to you first.
Thanks, Andrew. That is a great question. So how are businesses thinking about this? And I think it's worth reflecting on how do businesses think about AI? And if I just rewind back in my career, I was looking after data science analytics teams who were working with our clients, some of the largest companies in the world, and in new AI data science techniques a few years back. At that point, AI, some of the newer machine learning techniques, etc., were isolated to these data science functions, these centers of excellence that had been set up, whether that was in the bank or the retail or the telco company. And so it was self-constrained in some ways because it was one group that was developing these algorithms. It was one stop shop for looking at how are those algorithms being developed, what kind of use cases are they being applied to, where in the business are we leveraging those algorithms. You fast forward to today, and we really see AI being much more pervasive across the organization. Those use cases are no longer limited to one group that's doing the development work or in one business function. We see whether it's supply chain, customer experience, operations, your fraud departments, they're all leveraging AI analytics techniques to improve their operations, to create differentiation. That makes it really challenging for really large organizations to now be able to control how that AI is applied, to control the decisions that AI is making. And coming back to what Felipe said there, the human centricity piece, even when the decision is automated, is there a human who is ultimately responsible for the decision that's being actioned? So I think many organizations have had to move to looking at general guidelines, putting in frameworks to support application of AI. Some of those organizations, because they've seen the backlash of when they get it wrong and consumers don't like it, AI being applied in certain circumstances. And so we're seeing that AI is becoming the responsibility of roles like the chief data officer to think about not just enabling the organization with the tools, but also how do we start to govern how AI is used and applied across the business and really pervasively across the business.
So Natalia, I want to bring you in here and kind of take the question in a slightly different way. Do we actually need this? I mean, I know you and others have worked hard on thinking about these guidelines, but why is there a need for it sort of seems like we have to keep on convincing businesses they need to actually do these things because they're not perhaps innate. So why is this a problem that we need to solve?
Thank you for the question, Andrew, and it's a really, really good one, an important one. And this is something not all businesses ask themselves. Are we using the data correctly? Are we implementing AI correctly? Because AI function is in many cases not the central to the business. It is somewhat support, it has support role in their organization. And in this case, businesses do not pay that much attention to what is happening there, how they should curate their data, how they should take care of their data, how they use it in operations. This is all very important. And AI is something new. This is not something we use in practice for very, very long. And best practices are simply not there. So every business, when coming to the question, is my AI ethical, has to decide it for itself. And it's not always the case that they have resources to do that, or they have education to do that, or simply they cannot find proper guidelines. So in practice, AI as ethical as business decides it should be ethical. for now.
And do you think it varies, Natalia, sort of around the world? Are some parts of the world thinking more about this than others, or thinking differently about this to others? And I'll go with you, Natalia, first, but I also want Yasmeen's perspective on this, given that you're both have perspectives on different parts of the world. So Natalia, what's your thoughts?
Well, of course, it's not the same. It differs a lot across geographies. I think that from really my personal experience, AI ethics is mostly developed in more developed countries with more technical businesses, and it's far less developed in smaller economies. It's just historically there are less resources and less opportunities for businesses to look at these problems. So in many cases, AI has to comply with regulations, but in some countries it's completely unregulated, and so it's more difficult for businesses to regulate themselves, of course.
Yasmeen, from your experience working with clients, customers in lots of different parts of the world, what's your take on this?
I would have to agree with Natalia. I don't think it's consistent across the globe. In fact, I think it has a lot to do also with societies and cultures and what's acceptable, what's not. And often for a society and culture, what's acceptable or what consumers, individuals, citizens are willing to accept is reflected in law. So there's typically more regulation in Europe, and so a lot of regulation will often drive companies to take those steps even before the regulation is written, because there's that feeling of responsibility and it will be regulated. Whereas, having lived in Europe and now living in the US, I see the difference there between those geographies. In the US, there's typically less regulation. In some areas, there's kind of more innovation pushing the boundaries, and then at some point some regulation will come in, but it's not consistent across the US. And then you see in Asia Pacific, in Australia, it really again varies by country, varies by geography, and it is linked to that legal regulatory system of what's accepted and how our business is governed, and crucially, what are citizens and consumers expecting.
And actually, Yasmeen, what about, we talk about geography, but what about different industries? Are there differences there? And actually maybe some industries are either, more on top of this than others, or, more in need of thinking about responsible AI than others. What's your experience with all those different industries?
That's a great lens to look at it, Andrew. And I would even take it a step deeper than the industry level. It's the use case and the application level, because even within an industry, there are some business use cases, some business functions, departments where AI is more freely leveraged versus other areas in the business. And I think it comes down to what's the business outcome. So how much risk are we willing to accept with that business outcome if the AI gets it wrong or if the AI is biased? So say we have AI applied to our supply chains. If the supply chain is not quite efficient, it might have a negative impact on the business, but nobody's going to splash that across the front pages as being a biased algorithm or unethical. However, anytime you're dealing with citizens or customer experience or consumer applications of AI, it takes on another lens. So I think naturally some industries have more consumer, citizen, say it's healthcare or it's banks or retailers, have a lot of consumer and citizen data, and they're leveraging AI on that data. And so there is more scrutiny there. Whereas if you go to the manufacturing industries, maybe less so, because again, the application of the AI, the outcome, there's maybe less ethical considerations on that outcome.
So that's a good point, sort of how close you are, I guess, to the humans, which is essentially back to Felipe's principle of human-centricity, I guess. Natalia, I want to come back to you with a different question, though, around, how do we get businesses to really pay attention and embed this? It sort of comes to a question that's that's come up already from some of our executive diploma students. But if I'm a manager in some organization, how do you convince me that beyond it just being kind of the right thing to do, that I really need to think deeply about this and embed it in the way that we're doing things, when it's yet another thing that I need to in some sense comply with. So practically speaking, how do we get the right people in organizations to be thinking about this in, I guess, an action way as opposed to a sort of a token gesture kind of way?
It's a great question. Thank you, Andrew. And if we look even deeper, we need to ask ourselves, how can any individual working with AI impact the outcome and be ethical? Because when it comes to AI implementation, it's not only about managerial decisions. In many cases, when it comes to manager, there is a lot of steps done. For example, data collection or data cleaning, or just dissemination some information about how AI is operating. So I would say it is important to every business role to think about what is that we're doing. And it's important to understand, at least on very high level, what is AI doing with which you're working. In many cases, managers and other industry roles don't really know very well what's happening, and it is up to higher management to educate to the level people understand what are the consequences, and not only short-term like tomorrow consequences, but more longitudinal consequences. If I use this data on what will be impact on the society or on my clients next year, in 2 and 10 years. Unfortunately, there are not many use cases now, and in general, management is not aware what can go wrong. But it's probably our role as educators and institutions to build more these cases, to say, okay, that there are so many things that can go wrong, and we need to think about them now. And like the role of education here is super important.
So I guess if I'm sort of to synthesize actually what both you and Yasmeen said, there's the extent to which the consequences are sort of almost the proximity to potential consequences for human beings, your customers, society, and citizens. That suggests how, in some sense, seriously this needs to be thought through. And then I guess that's Yasmeen's point. And then Natalia, your point is, well, actually, it's everyone's responsibility. This is not something that just has to exist in sort of the technical parts of an organization with the computer scientists or data scientists and engineers who have to certainly think about it from certain dimensions and govern it in certain ways. It's not just for sort of the middle and upper management to sort of say, hey, we need to impose these rules and these regulations, these frameworks. It's for everyone who's thinking about how data may be used, how algorithms may be used to inform or make decisions or make recommendations, and so on and so forth, which I think these are very, very important practical perspectives. It's sort of a top-down and a bottom-up, technical and non-technical sort of set of things to think about. I guess the other point I'd add, Natalia, is to never forget about the law of what I call the law of unintended consequences. And that's we may see that through the lens of uncertainty, but we may also see that as almost a proposition or a challenge to people in organization to say, no, it's not just about what's obvious that could go wrong here, and therefore how do we prevent that, but what are kind of the less obvious things, and maybe to think a little bit more out of the box on those unintended consequences. Obviously, you can't have everything on your radar, but at least expanding that set of possibilities may indeed be another way to practically help in thinking about implementing, responsible, ethical AI. So I think that's all you. So I've got more questions for you, but I actually want to come to a question that was posed by one of our diploma students, Joanna, who's in the US at the moment. And it's sort of to this point, I think, about everyone being responsible. But her question is, well, who needs to be in the room? So how do you get the right people or the right personas essentially in the room to express their concerns, to think about perhaps these unintended consequences within an organization. So if it's not just the technical people, if it's not just, say, middle and upper management, who should, basically have a voice in governing this within organizations? I think it's a really important question in terms of how we implement it. Yasmeen, what do you think?
That's a good question, and I think it's back to what you were saying, Andrew. It's really important that it's not just the analysts or the data scientists who are thinking about the implications of the ethics or the fairness of algorithms being applied. In fact, it's more important than ever to have business leaders, business people in the room to discuss the implications of analytics and algorithms and AI being applied, because typically it's those business leaders and those business people who really understand the application and how that application will go out in the world. And so what we found it helpful to do is focus your key stakeholders on specifics of what is that use case that you're trying to drive and what's the outcome. And when thinking about the responsible use of algorithms, it's useful to think about what if the algorithm got it wrong. And in analytical terms, when we're using algorithms, we often talk about false positives or false negatives. What's the chance that if we predict something to be true, it's actually not true, it's false positive, or a false negative if we say it's not true, but it does actually happen to be true? With this application of the algorithm, what's acceptable to us as a business? And the use case often drives that acceptability. So think about in healthcare, we've seen use cases around AI and algorithms being used and applied to mammograms or CT scans to look at, are there abnormalities with that image? And so actually to get a false negative where the algorithm said there's nothing wrong, but there actually is, in a healthcare situation, that might not be acceptable. You need a high level of accuracy for an algorithm. So at that point, if you're able to, as a business, express what, the algorithm can run, but there's a level of accuracy that's acceptable to the business problem, that then gives your data science, your analytics teams a direction to say, okay, we can go into testing algorithms in this area, but until we don't get to a level of specificity, and the business teams can help to define what that level of specificity is, that algorithm is not acceptable for production or real world use. And so I describe that scenario because I think it's a useful way. I liked how I got a preview of the paper that the team have been working on at Oxford with the ICC, and that Felipe described it earlier. You need a way of making these vague conversations about ethics and fairness, etc., more tangible, more real world. How can you apply them in business? Getting into a little bit more of the details around the algorithm and what level of accuracy is acceptable helps to frame the conversation in a implementation. How can we move forward? What's the level of acceptability?
Thanks, Yasmeen. I think that's a really, really helpful way to think about these, errors. I know in statistics we would call them type 1 and type 2 errors, but so the false positives and the false negatives, and what might the consequences of those be if the algorithm is wrong for whatever reason, whether it's the wrong algorithm or the data is not quite right, or there's some bias for one reason or another. But then, in practical terms, okay, well, if it gets it wrong, what does that mean? And what is our tolerance, or required level of precision, if you want to think about it differently, in those situations? I think that brings it down to sort of conversations that you actually have. And back to Joanna's question, I think, therefore, the people in the room need to be the people who can really talk about what those real life consequences would actually be. What would those errors mean to the customers, to other people who might be affected, maybe to your employees, to regulators, to whoever else might be a relevant stakeholder. So I guess the point is have that diversity of opinion and sort of that multi-stakeholder perspective, quote unquote in the room to think about these things. But the question actually is, how do you frame the questions? How do you get them to think about these issues? And I think that sort of false positives, false negatives, is a really useful way of thinking. So we're about at the midpoint of our broadcast. I just wanted to welcome anyone who's joined us, since the beginning. You're obviously watching Leadership in Extraordinary Times here at the Saïd Business School at the University of Oxford. I'm Professor Andrew Stephen, the L'Oreal Professor of Marketing and the Research Dean, and I've been talking with Dr. Yasmeen Ahmad from Teradata and Dr. Natalia Efremova from here at the Saïd Business School. And we're talking about how businesses can use AI responsibly. I want to now go to have a look at our poll and see what you all thought about who should be responsible for responsible AI. So if we can take a look at the results, and then I'm going to see what both Natalia and Yasmeen think about this. So there's no clear front runner, I suppose, here, but the government is on top, followed by sort of the global intergovernmental organizations, the tech companies, industry bodies, and individuals last. But quite a spread here. So to be honest, that's not exactly what I expected to see. I'm kind of intrigued by this. What do you think, Natalia? What's your reaction to our poll result?
Well, that's very interesting. I also didn't expect this. And I would say, wow, that would be amazing if a government would be able to control it and provide us all guidelines what we should be doing. Unfortunately, for now, it's not the case. We do have some recommendations from policymakers, and I think that's amazing that we are moving towards this direction. But unfortunately, currently, probably the only regulations, like hard regulations that exist inside the companies, inside big technical industry organizations. Intergovernmental and international bodies do catch up slowly, and they do publish their own guidelines and sets of recommendations. What I believe is that inputs from all levels are very important. And why, from technical perspective, I believe that it's difficult for governments to do is they really don't have a tool for now to check what is AI doing. So no one outside of the organization can check what the algorithm is doing. And even if someone wants to check the code, the problem can be not in the code, but in the data or elsewhere in the operations or production line. So it's very, very complex problem. And until we develop this centralized understanding, centralized guidelines, how AI should be developed, probably the responsibilities would be largely on the companies themselves, because they know their business is the best.
Yasmeen, what do you think?
I have to agree with Natalia there. It's such a complex problem to try and find a regulation or a framework that would cover the amount of innovation that is happening in this space at the moment, that it's very hard for a government to regulate. And having said that, regulation often happens after the fact. Regulation looks at how technologies, how digital is being leveraged, and then looks to regulate uses. So I think companies do have a real responsibility to make sure that they are responsible and accountable for the algorithms that they're developing and how they are applying them. And as I think about organizations, I don't think it's about just the strict frameworks or guidelines. I think all large organizations will have a ethics framework. It was mentioned earlier, often the foundations have been there in the organization. They need to be evolved. The ethics frameworks need to be evolved to take into account new risks or new factors that have come up because of AI and digital. So yes, there's existing frameworks, they need to evolve, but we also need to look at company cultures and how a company leads through this evolution and this change, because AI, digital analytics is now impacting all aspects of our lives, all aspects of organizations. And so some of the ethics and the fair and the equal and unbiased use of algorithms needs to be embedded in company culture. It needs to be embedded in how people build these tools, how they apply the algorithms, how they analyze data. To Natalia's point, it's so complex. There's so many touch points. There's so many people that are involved in the process. It needs to be part of the DNA of the organization to want to have ethical use of these new technologies, new tools at their disposal.
So there's a question that's come up from Richard in my home country of Australia, in fact, who's asking about, this point about innovation that both of you talked about. So if we regulate, I guess, too much, the worry is that it will sort of box in the opportunities that might therefore stifle innovation. So, I think, in answer to sort of that point that Richard has made, which I think you've both already sort of talked to, I guess it feels like this balance of, yes, we need to have some, I guess, guidance from government and intergovernmental organizations, but obviously they can't cover everything, and nor probably should they. And I guess these regulations, because of the need for further innovation and the fact that is happening anyway, we need to sort of have these as living regulations in some sense, or at least guidelines around that. And I think, to me, my take on the poll results is actually it's sort of everyone's responsibility in one way or another. So I think this is just as we were saying, we need multiple voices in the room to think about those consequences and unintended ones and the false positives and false negatives. I guess the point is, at that higher level, we also need this to not only be something that governments do, not only something that intergovernmental organizations do, but indeed something that companies do, groups of companies or organizations, the tech companies, and so on and so on. So I think there's a need for this to be, I guess, governed with a small g in a very collective way, which of course is going to be fraught with difficulties, given all those different stakeholders. But what I'm hearing is that seems to be a way forward. I want to bring back Felipe now and bring him back into the conversation, because I think we've just got quite a few questions now that have been popping up. Thank you to those of you who have asked questions that I think we can start to go through. And also, don't forget that all of these episodes you can listen to as podcasts. If you just search for Leadership in Extraordinary Times on whichever podcast platform you like the most, you will find all of our previous episodes as well as this one, which will be out soon. So Felipe, welcome back. Just quickly, before we go on to some more questions, what was your take on those poll results?
Very similar to everybody else's. It does, I think I have very similar read to you, in that it does seem like it is very much like it's a joint responsibility. Like everybody has to carry some of the burden. The other bit that I think, going to that first point that we have, governments are being the most responsible, even if by a narrow margin. I guess a bit of a word of caution or concern here, from somebody that hasn't lived forever in the developed world. Not everybody's government is fantastic. Not everybody's government has your best interest in mind. So just saying necessarily that, whose government is going to decide what is correct to do, I think that's something to worry about. That's something that I'll put out there and just say, yes, regulation matters. Very much to your point, there is a concern against the attention against innovation. But some companies are going to be restricted exclusively to their regional domains, and they will have just one set of legislation to worry about. A number of companies are going to exist across national boundaries, and then you run into issues where you're picking and choosing to the bare minimum of legal requirement rather than doing the ethical thing or doing the appropriate thing for yourself or your company, etc., by just forcing others to say, all right, what's the bare minimum I have to do? And that's what you do, and you exploit everybody at the end. That's kind of moving away from ethics and just saying, hey, just let me make as much money as I can as quickly as I can until somebody catches on.
So a good point, though. Not all governments are necessarily the right governments, I suppose you could say here. And then, just to reinforce your point about large organizations, I think, as we've seen actually with other areas of responsibility, such as environment and social responsibility, I'm thinking about ESG, the UN SDGs, we see large multinationals actually having a big impact. Different countries in some sense, the norms of business behavior in different countries just because of their global reach. So I think there is an important role of business, particularly businesses with an international footing, to sort of lead by example in a lot of this, and of course collaborate with those other stakeholders that we talked about. But speaking about government, and there's a question from Andrew, who's one of our executive students here, who does work for a government, and is asking, should there be a hierarchy of government concern? Starting with regulation, for physical risk to the individual. So in other words, I guess more broadly, are there different bits of this that different stakeholders or different sort of entities need to be thinking about? Maybe governments thinking about sort of that type of harm, organizations thinking about other types of harm, perhaps. I don't know. Let's start with Yasmeen, and then I want to hear what the others also think about this, because I think it's a really important practical question. Yasmeen.
That's a great question, because the implications of how algorithms are used, it is a multidimensional challenge of there's various types of risks that can be created. So as I think about even our organization and our risk framework, there are a whole diverse set of or categories of risks that we consider to our business. And for a government, I don't see why it wouldn't be the same with AI. So as I think about different types of risk, the one that popped into my mind, we did a use case with a retailer around wastage. And we know how much sustainability is important right now. And in this use case, we were actually supporting the retailer through AI to reduce waste, to reduce how much grocery products were thrown away at the end of the day. But equally, on the vice versa, AI has also almost accelerated or amplified the fast fashion business and other businesses that are creating a ton of waste. And so you can begin to think about AI algorithms and the different types of risk or implications they have to societies. There is the sustainability in terms of green and environmental impacts. There is impacts to humans and peoples and jobs and careers. There's impact to diversity, equality, inclusion. So if I was to think about how to put that framework together for government, I would be thinking about those different categories. And in terms of prioritization, there's definitely some categories that you may prioritize over and above others, those that have impact to human life, for example. But equally, I think all of those categories are important and potentially require specialists or experts, or again, business experts who understand those areas and are able to fully think through the implications of AI, which may not be apparent initially to you as a developer or a builder of the tools or the technology platforms. But when you begin to speak to these different business entities, you realize implications which were unknown, because this is just such a new application of analytics in new areas.
So another question, and this one I'm going to direct at you, Felipe. This comes from Dennis, who's here in the UK. And he's asking or suggesting, shouldn't all innovation be governed by the purpose of the company, hopefully being mindful to human beings, then the planet, and then finally profit in that order? So what do you think? And all innovation, I guess, including the way that we think about AI and develop it and use it.
I mean, I do like the word hopefully there, right? And I think that's the crux of the problem that we're getting here. And it's one of my favorite things when we talk about even teaching ethics and discussing ethics, is that all discussions about ethics are trivial. Like, none of it matters until there's a trade-off being made. right? So everybody agrees that we should protect privacy until it's 10% of your sales that goes away if you take that action. Then suddenly everybody in the boardroom just goes, maybe we think about this some more, right? So it's never a problem until it touches kind of that money component. And that's a large part of this initiative and this project and the research and the guidance is yeah, I think ultimately we want individuals to self-determine and say, yeah, your business is going to decide what is the best innovation, and it will make the good choices. Frameworks like these are to help people make the right choice when the time comes. If you're making a choice when there's no consequence for your business, if you're not giving something up, then you're not really facing a choice. You're just doing the right thing kind of with no cost. I'm always more curious when it's somebody's mortgage payment. If you can't pay rent, if you lose your job because you did the right thing, that's your ethical quandary. That's the thorn in the question. And that's when it matters having this grounding of, I know what my company stands for, I know I'm going to be backed for doing the right thing, even if it's going to cost us revenue. Doing the right thing is just what we're going to do. And not just because it was legally required that, this is what keeps me out of jails, because this is the right thing to do in what you said, for people, for environment, for etc.
So, again, comes back to that, it can't just be sort of one set of rules imposed from on high, whoever that happens to be, whether it's government or the organization or some mix. You need that bottom up, or that sort of, everyone has to think about this. But that's the tension as well. Because once you make it personal, then people are different, and so that's why this is messy and complex. But that's why we do need to be talking about these issues and finding ways to take action on them. I'm going to go to another question now. This one's for you, Natalia. Is there a sense that algorithmic tools or models are held to a higher standard than what would be applied to humans in similar situations? A bit of a human versus machine type of consideration here, but is that true?
It's an interesting question, and I would say it depends on what kind of algorithm we're talking about. So definitely some algorithms that are performing much better than humans, of course, they had to be scrutinized more because they just work on a very, very different level of accuracy. For some algorithms, it's not really that important. Like, think about automatic irrigation system. Well, is it that important that it gives the precise amount of water +2, -3 milliliters? Probably not. So it really matters what kind of application we're talking about. Going back to Yasmeen's point about medical applications, if we think about human health and X-ray analysis results, is there a single chance that it can go wrong? No. If something can go wrong there, if the algorithm can potentially be incorrect, even when this chance is tiny, should we go for this algorithm? No. It really depends on this large hierarchy of risks, in which at the top is the human as a human being and his physical and financial and other assets, and then going back down to say danger or risk that technology imposes. So I would say it's, again, complex problem. All problems in this discussion seem to be very complex. But it's really impossible to tell. But we also need to think beyond the problem itself. So what people often not consider is what are the bigger risks. For example, when we talk about large data centers who drone their servers and thus they save electricity on cooling of the data centers. Do they always think about ocean and warming the water and how it impacts wildlife in a long term? So this is incredibly complex, I would say, system of questions that we need to ask ourselves.
And I think it comes to sort of this I guess the undertone there is thinking about the fallibility of humans versus the algorithms, and where potential bias might come in. And so I think we've got time for one more question, and I want to pose this one to you, Yasmeen, because I think it's related to that. And this comes from Walid, who's in Saudi Arabia, and he's talking about essentially the use of AI in judicial decisions, or implementing laws. For example, in the context of getting rid of corruption in an environment where maybe there is corruption, to sort of let the presumably non-corrupt algorithm make these decisions. How do you feel about that and those sorts of approaches of replacing the fallible humans with the less fallible machine?
That's a very interesting question, and it does link on from the previous question. In fact, there have been algorithms specifically in the US judicial system that have been used, for example, to predict the likelihood of reoffending for people who have been convicted of a crime. And some of those algorithms, the predictions have been used as part of the judicial decision-making process of, do you give somebody bail, or various decisions that might be linked to that person and their life and circumstances. And actually, I can't quote the exact paper here, but happy to share offline. Some of those algorithms have been shown to be biased because, again, when you look at the judicial system, you might end up, as you train algorithms, you're potentially training them and they're learning biases from the world that we live in today. And so they are reinforcing those biases or potentially amplifying those biases, that they're a person of a certain race or a color or a background level of education is now more likely to reoffend. And that gets very dangerous. And actually, it's a great example of this whole ethical question. We want to give every human person a fair chance in life. But if the algorithm has learned from real world data that if you're of a certain background, you live in a specific zip code, and you have a certain level of education, you're likely to commit an offense, that's dangerous. We're now no longer giving an individual a fair chance at life. We're stereotyping them based on circumstances of their upbringing or their life or where they've lived. And so this is where it gets very gray, as Natalia was mentioning, and how do we think about these applications? Even though you can do it, should you do it? And so I think, can you do it? Absolutely. You can train algorithms. Do you want to apply it? Do we think it's fair? Do we think it's ethical? Is another question. And it's important to consider that question before just taking an algorithm based on its output and applying that to society. Because worst case scenario, you now create a flywheel or a perpetuating situation where a certain part of society is disadvantaged and the algorithm is reinforcing that, and people can't escape that cycle. So I think just looking at that history of where the algorithms have been applied in the judicial system, we have to be careful about how they were applied and what consequences that has for people.
Right, I was going to say it's back to that law of unintended consequences, but we know that those shouldn't be unintended consequences now. And I guess really to me this reminds us that yes, humans might be flawed in making certain types of decisions, and maybe we might put some hope in an AI system or a set of algorithms, but they're going to not be perfect either. And really, I think it's the bringing together what I always like to call augmented intelligence of the humans and the machines, where we probably have a better chance of actually doing things and reducing those types of errors that Yasmeen introduced earlier in the program. So unfortunately, we're out of time. We could keep talking about this, but the clock is unforgiving. So I just want to thank Yasmeen, Natalia, and Felipe for spending some time with all of us today to talk about these very complex issues. And I'm sure it's not the first time we've talked about these in Leadership in Extraordinary Times, and it certainly won't be the last. So thank you to my panelists for joining. Thank you to you for joining. Next week, on Tuesday at 2 o'clock UK time, we have our Dean, Peter Tufano, joined by Gillian Tett, who's the US editor-at-large for the Financial Times. And they're going to be talking about how anthropology, interestingly, can explain business and indeed life. That sounds like it's going to be a pretty fascinating conversation with Peter and Gillian. I really hope you'll be able to join us for that. But for now, thank you for watching. Once again, thanks to my guests. This is Andrew Stephen here at the Saïd Business School. Take care and we'll see you soon.